Hey folks, this is Vince with Dad's Gaming Addiction, and today I'm going to quickly teach you how to play Sourcebound. Now, before we actually get over to Tabletop Simulator to show you how the game actually works, I wanted to bring to your attention that the game will be crowdfunding through GameFound, and from what I was told, the game should be seeking funding around October 2024, but if that date doesn't work, then they're looking to launch this project around February, March of 2025. So around those lines, I just have to point out that what you're about to see is not fully reflective of the finished product. This is still a prototype. The art, for example, is finished on like the actual physical end, but the tabletop simulator module isn't 100% complete yet. So just be wary of that. So Sourcebound, according to the page right here, is a new TCG combining familiar and fun gameplay with a unique source system, among other quality of life improvements, creating a more enjoyable and smooth experience for both new and experienced players alike. Let's go ahead and jump over to Tabletop Simulator and I'll show you how the game is played. Alright, so this is the Sourcebound Tabletop Simulator module. You must own Tabletop Simulator in order to make use of it. I'll put a link to the Sourcebound Tabletop Simulator mod in the below description in case you want to try it out for yourself. So this particular module comes with some player mats. I like the blue one because, well, I like the art and I like the color blue, so it's a win-win for me. The module also comes with 6 60-card pre-made decks, and I'll go ahead and flip them over right here. There are 6 unique colors. I'll get into deck building and all of that later and what the limits are, but this particular module does contain pre-made decks. Just pick a deck that you like and have at it. Now, as I mentioned, the art in the Tabletop Simulator module is still prototype, as is evidenced here. So this is, again, not reflective of the finished product. Now, you're also going to see some other things. There are some 6-sided dice. Just simply use those for counters. You know, sometimes creatures might gain buffs or whatever. These will help track that. And then you've got a 20-sided die to help you keep track of your player health. And then lastly, there's a coin to determine first player. A quick note about deck building. Now, you can create a deck of one color or multiple colors if you want to, but it must contain a minimum of 60 cards and cannot have more than 3 of a particular card in your deck. So for example, if you have 4 of these insult to injury cards in your library, you can only bring 3 with you into your game. Now the rulebook does mention something about side decks, and these are primarily used for tournament play and competitive play or best of series, that kind of thing. It's a 12-card deck, and it allows you to sort of swap out cards from one game to the next, but you must remember never to break that more than 3 card of a particular kind rule. The game contains a lot of different card types, and for the sake of expediency, I'm not going to go over every single one, but I did pull out some samplings for you so you can kind of see what you're getting into, and these are primarily what you'll see if you make use of this particular module. The first type I wanted to quickly touch on were champions. So champions act like planewalkers do in Magic the Gathering. These guys have will markers that they will be gaining and losing through card effects or by taking damage, and if they run out of will markers, they are discarded. So it's kind of like a resource management kind of thing. You know, I need to gain a lot of will markers so I can spend this ability and you know, do something really powerful, but then again you're like, I gotta leave some in reserve so that I don't lose it. So again, resource management going on there. And most of these champions have some kind of like surge ability where if it does something specific, it gets a bonus of some kind, which is kind of cool. In this case, with Bridget, whenever you attack with your 3rd summon each combat, Bridget, Hero Knight, surges, which means activate another will ability this turn. And you can see below there, you get plus will for doing this, or minus will for doing this. And the starting will tokens would be on the very bottom there. According to that, it's 4. Now, to actually play these cards, a lot of these cards have similar iconography on the upper left-hand corner, but in the case of Obese here, Mad Genius, in the upper left-hand corner, there's a gray 3, and then there are 3 yellow symbols right below that. So this card needs 6 source in order to play it, and 3 of it can be any color, and 3 of it must be yellow. Some other card types that you'll actually see, summons are very common. Summons are just played out onto the battlefield with the intention of doing damage to your opponent. The cost for playing it, upper left-hand corner, the name of the card and what it can do in the very middle, the numbers in the bottom left, that number/number, typically that's how much damage it can do and what its health is respectively. And you'll note on the very bottom, in upside down text, it says basic source with a particular color. So a lot of these cards in this game are dual function, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But for now, we'll take a look at the rest of these cards. There are hexes, and hexes are typically played immediately to your crypt, which is like your discard pile, and they do something. So they're like non-tangible. They don't go out into the play area. You play them, you get the effect, then you discard it. And they could be good or bad depending on the card type. You have these enchantments, which are tangible, and sometimes they're even attached to characters, and they're either going to be played out onto your tableau or onto a character, and again, they could do something good, they could do something bad. You've got other niche cards like relic summons, which have some conditions associated with them and what they could do. Again, there's just so many cards to mention to go over that I'll leave it at that. I'll let you discover these on your own. What's not mentioned here, and I don't think it's in the Tabletop Simulator module, there's something called fortresses. Fortresses act like shields, so to speak. If you've ever played Star Realms, there are star bases in that game, which force the player to attack them as opposed to the actual player. So if I have a fortress in front of me, my opponent must first target the fortress before they can do damage to me. So you'll be seeing more and more cards as time goes on, and I'll let you discover those on your own. I mentioned earlier that a lot of the cards are dual function. Let me explain. So in Magic the Gathering, there are cards called land cards, which are used to pay for other cards to enter play. They have no purpose in the game other than to be played and used as lands in order to play other cards. And typically, whenever you're building your deck in Magic the Gathering, you want to devote about 24 or so land cards to your deck, which means you've got 36 other cards that you can kind of mess around with there. So almost half of your deck is just cluttered with economic cards that don't do anything else but pay for other cards. Well, the answer to that, at least in this game, is to make most of these cards dual function. Whenever you, during an appropriate part of your turn, which I'll get into a little bit later, whenever you play a card, you can play it as either the card itself, or you can play it as a basic source. So cards in this game can be played as economic cards. There's more to that, but that's the primary difference with this game versus some of the other games I've seen. Instead of going into a game with half of your deck being devoted to economic only cards, you can bring pretty much anything you want into a game with Sourcebound here, and the majority of your cards can be used economically. So that's the primary difference between the two, and it's highly worth pointing out because it adds so much more flexibility to your deck building. To set up the game, each player will shuffle the deck of cards they brought with them into that game, and then temporarily give that deck to their opponent so that they can cut that deck. You're going to determine the start player any way you see fit. Flip a coin, roll a d6, whatever. You're going to draw a hand of 7 cards, and you can mulligan as much as you want with a penalty. So if you want to mulligan, you cast your cards aside into a discard pile, and then you draw that many minus 1. So if you had 7 cards and you mulliganed, you would get rid of those cards and draw 6 instead. Now, it's worth mentioning that the second player gets 1 free mulligan, so they don't have to take that penalty one time. So you're going to set your starting life to 30. In the case of Tabletop Simulator, grab 2 d20, set 1 to 20, and 1 to 10. And then lastly, the first player will take their turn. It's worth mentioning that the first player will not draw a card for their first turn. It's worth mentioning real quick that any cards that you did mulligan as part of setup, you'll want to shuffle back into your draw pile, because in this game, once your draw pile runs out, that's it. Game over. So make sure that you take your mulliganed cards and shuffle them back into your deck once you're done with the whole mulligan process. At the beginning of a player's turn, they're going to refresh all permanents that they control. So if these were exerted from a previous turn, we're going to go ahead and just right side up these cards. There we go. And they are now ready to go. You're going to draw one card. In the case of Tabletop Simulator, just right click on the deck and click on the draw button. It automatically draws from here and adds it to your hand. Lastly, if there are any effects that would normally take place at the beginning of a player's turn, they would trigger here. The next step of a player's turn is player phase 1, and that player can do one of three things. They can either play a card from their hand, they can transmute, or they can break. To play a card, you'd simply take a look at your hand and play one card as a source. So let's just say I decide to play this, I flip it upside down as a basic source, and there you go. That's playing a card as a source. That's one of the three things I can do. Instead, I could transmute a card. And to transmute, I would pay one source. So I would exert this, for example. And I could turn a unit that is already out here into a source. So let's just say that I want to turn Valiant Cavalier here into a source. I would pay the one, which is what I did here, and I could turn it into a source. Now, it's worth mentioning that whenever you do this, any enchantment or anything else that might have been on that card goes away. So this could be tactical in some way. If your opponent played a nasty card onto one of your cards and you're trying to get rid of it and don't know how, you could transmute your card, turning it into a source, and then get rid of your opponent's debuff that way. So there are reasons why you may want to bring back some of your units as sources. Lastly, there is the break action. In order to break, that's pretty self-explanatory. You're going to take a look at one of your sources that are in your source area and break it. You're going to actually turn it into a playable unit onto your field. So for example, let's just say I want to bring this one out. You're going to take a look at the cost of it. In this case, it looks like it's two of these white symbols. So I would pay that much in source in order to play it. So I would exert 1 and exert 2. And off I go. This is now a unit that I control. The downside to doing this is that you're not adding any new sources. In fact, you're taking away from your economy area. So that's less to work with in the future. But if there's a very powerful card that you have in your hand and you know you can't play it now, you could play it as a source and then maybe 5 or 6 turns down the road, then turn it into an actual unit. So there's a lot of different actions, a lot of different strategy when deciding what to do with these. In addition to doing one of the 3 source actions, the active player can play spell cards from their hand at this point by paying their cost. So I'm not going to look, this is just a quick example. Let's just say that was a spell of some kind. I would play it, pay the cost via exerting the appropriate sources. Now, priority would shift to my opponent at this point, and they would have the opportunity to play something on top of it. So let's just say he played that card on top of it in order to combat it. And at that point, these cards resolve from top to bottom as appropriate. Once the active player has declared that they're moving on to the combat phase, the opponent has one last chance to play something in response to that. So as far as the combat phase is concerned, the active player will choose one unit and declare it as an attacker. So as an example, let's just say that I declared first responder here as an attacker. My opponent at that point can choose to block that damage by assigning one of their cards to defend or block it. So we'll just move that card up there as an example. And then we'll move on again to the active player where they can choose another unit to declare as an attacker. So let's just say they declared this one here as an example, the Valiant Cavalier. And my opponent might go, I don't have any units that are strong enough to block that. I'll just take the hit. And then we move on to another one, and then so on, until the attacker is done declaring attackers. Now, during combat, it's worth mentioning that players can cast spells of instant speed and can react with activated abilities on summons and relics. So you're not limited to just attack and defense. You can do other certain things during this time. And after attackers and blockers are declared, you're going to move on to priority damage. There are some cards that have priority damage listed right on them. They do damage first. So any cards with priority damage will attack and do damage without taking damage themselves, which is kind of nice. and you'll resolve that. After you're done with priority damage, you move on to regular damage, and this is where units will simultaneously attack each other. So just as an example, this first responder has 2 attack and 2 defense on the bottom left there. And then this unit here, the Horde Thug, has 3 attack and 1 defense. So they're going to do their damage simultaneously. This Horde Thug does have overpower, so it will deal excess combat damage to defenders. These are little things that you'll want to look out for as you're playing this game. So as an example, this first responder would do 2 damage to the Horde Thug, and 2 is greater than 1, so the Horde Thug would be removed from play. At the same time, it's going to do 3 damage to this unit and also kill it, but it will overpower by 1, so I would actually take 1 point of damage against my personal health. As a quick reminder, any unopposed damage just goes right to the original target. So if Valiant Cavalier here was attacking the player, that player would lose life. If they were attacking an enemy champion, they would lose will, and so on. Now, real quick, just to take a quick look, this particular card has priority attack on it, which means that they would have done damage during an earlier step in this combat phase. They also have this enchantment blessing, bestow summon, attached to a summon. Bestowed summon gets +1/+2 and has siphon. You gain life equal to the damage it deals. So, little things to look at as you're playing these cards and resolving them. After the combat phase is over, it moves on to player phase 2, and during this time, that player, the active player, has the ability to take one of the special source actions, play, break, or transmute, assuming they haven't done so this turn already. They can also play any spells from their hand that they wish, so as long as they can pay for it. Once player phase 2 is over, you move on to the end phase, and this is just a step-by-step process. Effects that trigger at the end of this turn will trigger now until end of turn, and this turn effects will end. You banish all spells and abilities still on a stack. Damaged summons heal back up to their full defensive value. The active player discards down to their maximum hand size of 7, and all resources are emptied from all players' resource stockpiles unless stored on a terrain. This will continue back and forth with players taking turns until the game ends, and typically the game will end in a couple of ways. If someone's life force reaches 0, and also if you happen to try and draw a card or burn a card, and you have no more cards in your draw pile, that will also count as being eliminated from the game. You can also concede early if you think the game is just not going your way. And there may be other cards or effects that may sort of trigger an end of the game. I haven't seen any of those yet, but it's in the rulebook, so I'm sure they're coming at some point. Before we go, I wanted to quickly highlight some important differences, and yes, these are already in the video, but these are super important. I have to stress these because they really make the game. First and foremost, most of these cards are dual function. They can be played as a card or as a source, meaning your economy and your cards are all one, which is really cool. Like there's no more of this, okay, 24 land and 36 units. No, all of your cards, or most of them, will be dual function, which gives you more deck building options. I really like that. And then number 2 is a play off of number 1 in the sense that your special source actions, you can play a card as a source, you can transmute it, meaning taking it off of the table and putting it in as a source. If you really need more economic options later on in the game, you can take cards off and add it to your economy. Another good strategy is if you've got a negative card on one of your cards and you're trying to get rid of it, you can transmute your card and get rid of the nasty enchantment that your opponent plays there. And then later you can break it and take it from the source that you turned it into and put it back in as a unit. So I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of strategic plays and options that will be available to players as they discover them. And I think that's going to be the biggest learning curve is learning when to best use these different options. And then lastly, declaring attackers. I think that's super important too. You're declaring attackers one at a time, giving your opponent a chance to respond to each one at a time. And that can be like a game of chicken, kind of sort of, where, you know, you're declaring an attacker and your opponent goes, well, Are they going to declare with this one? I don't know. Maybe I save this blocker for this guy, but what if he doesn't attack with this one? You know, it's going to be one of those psychological mind game things. So I think that adds a bit more to it rather than going all in all at once. So yeah, super important differences between this game and other TCGs that I've played. And I really like these changes because I think they add a bit more tactical variety to the game. And I think just, you know, games that allow players to do more, I mean, you know, what's not to like about that? And there you have it, a quick look at Sourcebound and how to play it. So as a reminder, this game will be launching on GameFound. Again, the date is still sort of tentative at this point. We're looking at maybe October 2024 or February, March of 2025. Things are still subject to change. You can see a preview of it. I'll put a link in the below description for you. There are some links here and some other descriptors. There's also, in the meantime, the developer's website. You can check that out as well. It goes into what is Sourcebound, who is it appropriate for, and that kind of thing. And they're also currently working on this Playtest Central website. It's not done yet, but they're putting together, like, this is a link to the Tabletop Simulator page, print and play stuff. So it goes into different decks, like the Holy Boons. It'll describe what the deck is. You know, is the card draw below average? The removal is above average. The speed is fast. So it kind of gives you a heads up as to what these particular deck types do. So again, this page is a work in progress at this point. So definitely come back to it over the course of time just to see what else they happen to add to it. But I do like the fact that there's going to be some kind of library and rule explanation because, you know, in Magic the Gathering, I'm like, well, what does red do? What does green do? What does white do? And trying to find these sources can be difficult sometimes. Well, having like just a one-stop shop library like this would definitely help out a new player figure out what they like before they actually get into the game. So as I said, this game will be launching on GameFound at some point. I just don't have a hard date yet. So this is Vince. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you all next time. Take care.